Start the recording. Okay, so as everyone knows, I think there'll probably be more people next week too, because this week I think we're competing a little bit with another Michael from Harvard who's giving a talk in Beijing right now. Michael Sandel. I think he's doing AI ethics. Um, so this is a course, or this is a seminar series, I guess. We'll probably meet about 8 or 9 times. If you haven't come to a Sahai Weixia seminar before, these are offered free online for anyone who wants to come and listen to Professor Pewitt and I. So what we want to talk about is the contemporary significance of Confucian and Taoist philosophies. Of course, there's a bunch of different ways that we could do this. Today, I'll outline a couple of different uh, contemporary sort of issues that we might want to discuss in this class, and I'll go over some vocabulary that might help us all be on a similar page for what we want to talk about. And then yeah, so this is sort of what I'm envisioning. And then again, Michael, feel free to step in and disagree or add some other stuff. And hopefully at the end of the day, there's some time for discussion, although this is really just meant to be more of a framework, right? Just looking at some, let me see here, like a sort of general outline of some different terms and again, some scaffolding maybe. And then next week, maybe we'll sort of dig into one of the issues. We'll sort of take probably, right, Michael, play this sort of week by week. And then, yeah, sort of take turns with who's sort of a little bit more in charge one week and who's a little bit more in charge the other week. So this week I thought I'd give Michael a little bit of a break. And he likes to start off with a break, I feel like. So I'm taking over a little bit. And then maybe next week he takes over a little bit. So, by contemporary, some of the contemporary issues I think that we're interested in are issues that revolve around different conceptions of identity, and in particular, what Charles Taylor has called the age of authenticity. So, this is his book, A Secular Age, on the right here, where he coins this term. I think it's in this book. And then I have a couple other books. Again, I didn't consult with Michael, but for me, these are sort of important for how we might frame some of the discussions in this course or in this class. So the age of authenticity is related, of course, to individualism as well. Authenticity and individualism can be used interchangeably, and they often are, although they can also be distinguished from one another. And then more generally, we might be talking about identity or conceptions of the person. Also about agency or conceptions of choice, and also looking at these in particular today, for example, in terms of how different understandings or conceptions of agency today might be reflections of authenticity as well. Something else we can talk about, and we'll actually have a guest speaker 2 weeks from today from Beijing Capital Normal University, who works with Michael Sandel, and she's also done some work on merit, both in traditional China and in contemporary America. And so this is another issue that we might discuss as well, crisis of merit, or different conceptions of merit. In particular, for example, in Sandel's book, The Tyranny of Merit, he looks at feelings of hubris and worthlessness. And this might be something that we attempt to discuss as well in these classes. Thirdly, we might look at crisis of meaning. So, of course, many scholars have used the term alienation or have thought about being out of touch or trying to get back in resonance with the world. In particular, again, Michael, we might differ on this, but I'm very interested in the work of Hartmut Rosa. So maybe we'll talk a little bit about Hartmut Rosa, who's a German sociologist. And then perhaps we'll talk about some challenges from AI. These can come in many different forms, but maybe for our purposes, again, conceptions of the person or identity might be sort of on the top of our list. And then also ideas related to ethics or morality, maybe surveillance, maybe Nick Brostrom's newest book, Deep Utopia, right? Or the idea of a solved life. This might also be something that we can talk about. So, some of the different, oops, some of the different ways that we might reflect on this. So originally, this idea, Michael and I's idea of sort of coming together and doing something, came from my respect for his book, The Path, and then his pretending to respect, genuine pretending. I think it was the genuine pretending respect, but I'll leave it at pretending. Um, so in each of these books, we actually tried to do similar things. I don't know if this is how everyone else or other people would read it, but at least for us, we saw ourselves as doing something very similar. And this was mainly in terms of providing an alternative to conceptions of authenticity, and an alternative that did not necessarily rest on looking backwards, right? So, although the terminology, for example, in the path often talks about ritual, this is not necessarily sort of a return to past rituals, right? Or at least as I read the book, but ways of thinking about how we have rituals today and how we can utilize this form or this structure of interaction to do different things, right? So it's more about recognizing again, there might be some, yeah, sort of speaking to past rituals and learning from this as well, but also recognizing that we have rituals today and that we can do things with them, and that we can do things that are probably surprising in some ways because yeah, we don't often sort of think of them, let's say, critically, or we don't often think of the innovative avenues that they allow for developing new types of habits, for example, for alternating roles, and for ways that this can sort of uh, push us out from particular ways of thinking and interacting that are sometimes problematic. And again, um, I don't remember how much you use the term, but at least when you talk about it, Michael, you often authenticity is sort of the bad guy, right? So, and then in genuine pretending, authenticity is definitely the bad guy. One of the things we want to do is move away from readings of the Zhuangzi that say the Zhuangzi is all about authenticity. It's not surprising to have those types of reading because authenticity is very popular, right? So when something is popular, you can find it everywhere. Um, so two sort of paths that we looked at were a critical distance, right? A distance between how you think about yourself and the role that different roles that you might have. And then later on, thinking about actually various identity technologies or identity paradigms, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So more role-based understanding, which would be oftentimes sort of pre-authenticity, individualism or authenticity, and then maybe profiles, which Hans-Georg Muller and I argue sort of are important, are very important today. That genuine pretending is also allows you to distance yourself from these different technologies or from these different paradigms, and yeah, it gives you this space to sort of move to play sort of between them, right? So you can do this again with different roles that you have, but also with different identity technologies or identity paradigms. And again, this might be, Michael, me inserting my own perspectives a little bit, so feel free to limit it. But I think what one of the other things that we're both doing, and this is very much in response to the way that much of academia functions today, and particularly philosophy, is that we're reevaluating the role of the contingent. In philosophy, especially in America, for example, rituals are not usually considered something that are significant, right? And if they are, we typically have to sort of pull out from them what is somehow non-contingent. And in genuine pretending, we very much do the same thing. So I think both of us are looking at reevaluating concrete or particular aspects as being meaningful within themselves, right? So we don't necessarily have to come up with something beyond the concrete or beyond the particular, which then we sort of mold the concrete or the particular to fit, but rather we can sort of just stay within the concrete, stay within the particular, and still do things, right? We can still have critical distances, we can still develop whatever new habits, alternative role or alternate our roles, things like this, and that this is significant, like philosophically, interpersonally, etc. And what this also is about, and I mean, rituals say this very clearly, is developing more specific solutions to specific problems. So I think this is something that we both share as well. We're not necessarily talking about whatever ritual can solve everything, right? Or genuine pretending is the sort of end all be all. And if everybody just does genuine pretending, everything in the world will be perfect, right? Ritual is not going to solve everything either. But rather, what we're looking at are particular sort of specific tools that we can use um, and adapt in various ways to concrete or particular situations to come up with particular responses. This might give us a sort of different way than of thinking about philosophy in general. And it's a way that I think, again, Michael and I perhaps sort of share in our reading of early Chinese philosophy, that it's the approach is not necessarily after something universal or absolute. The approach is very different. It's more looking, again, at sort of timely solutions to particular contextual issues. And so, yeah, this is just, again, very different than what much of contemporary philosophy does. So, in terms of a general attitude, sorry, I didn't realize I repeated the one here, but I think one thing that the first thing that we might think about is we're looking perhaps more at what we can learn from the classics than necessarily what the classics say themselves. Of course, that doesn't mean that we're putting aside what the classics themselves say, but that the emphasis is on what we can do with this, right? So again, that does entail, of course, that we think very rigorously about what exactly the texts say. But we want to move on from just, this ritual or that ritual to thinking about the way the texts talk about ritual and how that might be useful for the way that we interact today or the way that we set up certain social or political institutions. So on the right here, I put a book by Henry Rosemont Jr., which I find to be very inspiring. In this book, um, he argues against individualism, and I think on page 17 or 18, he says something like, if you find that my readings of Confucianism are sort of totally off or they're totally terrible, that's fine. You can just call it a creative misreading because what I'm interested in is developing responses to contemporary problems. And if they're not Confucian responses, who cares? I still think these are worthwhile responses, and let's go from there. So I think that's part of maybe the attitude that we can take in this class, right? Of course, we should be critical about the way that we read the text, but the focus is not on, did you read the text better than me? But how can we together come up with novel ways or constructive ways to think about contemporary issues? And then secondly, or the second number one here is how early Chinese classics might help us, yeah, as I just said, to sort of rethink contemporary issues. So again, we're not looking necessarily for the better or the best ways of thinking, right? We don't have to argue that ritual is better than authenticity. I think Michael and I probably both think that, but we don't need to make that argument, right? We can just look at it as an alternative or ways that it can respond to, right? So again, we're not engaging in a search for universal or absolute solutions. We're looking for timely responses. Maybe one of the things we prioritize is appropriateness, both in terms of the method, but also in terms of how this actually plays out. And so um, this is something I think a little bit different. We're looking for more localized philosophical reflections, right? Or context dependent philosophical reflections as opposed to more universal or absolute. Okay, so some basic terminology and framework, at least for the first part, in terms of authenticity. Today, I want to just look very briefly at what we mean by authenticity, what we mean by identity, and then also how this is reflected in some understandings of agency. So again, our age of authenticity is can be seen in conceptions of the person and conceptions of choice. So most of the time, authenticity is read as a reaction to a more role-based understanding of the person. Um, Locating where and when authenticity came about is something that different scholars do very differently. So for Francis Fukuyama and some other scholars, it begins already with Christianity. It explodes a little bit with feudalism and private property. For other scholars, maybe it's the Industrial Revolution or the French Revolution. Some scholars would argue that it's uniquely Western. Some think it's tied to democracy. Some would trace it all the way back to Plato. Others say maybe it begins in the 1950s. Others would say the 17th century, 18th century. So there's tons and tons of different ways that we could locate, or there's tons of different places and times that we could locate authenticity. There's also tons of different definitions we could give for authenticity. Today, what I'll do is just give a very sort of general understanding that hopefully Michael doesn't disagree with too much, and maybe this can become a sort of common understanding for us in at least this class or seminar. So, what do we mean by identity and these different paradigms of identity that we'll talk about? We mean just very generally ways of making sense of ourselves and our world, to ourselves, in our interactions with others, in the context of society or political realms, and then in broader natural or cosmic contexts as well. So there can be at least three different general paradigms of identity. The first is role-based. This is sometimes called sincerity. This binds identity to the external, so external expectations, external roles, etc. And it demands commitment to these roles. The general understanding is that the outside is real and that the inside must honestly back it up, which is also why it's sometimes called sincerity, because the value sincerity is very closely associated with the moral or ethical demand of role-based understanding of the person. And if the inside doesn't honestly back up the outside, then it can be considered a dishonest fake. The second paradigm, and this is, I think, these first two, I think, are what we'll focus on mainly in these classes, is authenticity. A lot of times when we talk about individualism, it's very similar to authenticity. So probably for our sake, we can get rid of this distinction. I'll talk about it a little bit in a few minutes. If we find it's important, of course, we can go back to it. I think we can just use the term authenticity. Authenticity seeks to create or find identity within. It demands a pursuit of originality, and it says that the outside is real and the inside must be an accurate representation of it. Otherwise, it is considered a hypocritical facade. The third, and I don't know to what extent Michael would agree with this, but this is what I was working on the past couple years, is what we might have today, and this is prophilicity or profile-based way of constructing or curating identity. So this is the idea that identity is curated through public feedback. It demands a curation of profiles. So again, the outside is real and the inside must be truly invested in it. Otherwise, one is considered a deceptive fraud. So today we won't talk about prophilicity or profiles, but maybe in future meetings we will, maybe we won't. So this role-based understanding, right, sometimes referred to as sincerity, again, binds identity to external social roles. So this image that I have over here has a woman and she has all these different stickers, right? These are all her different roles, and these are all different ways that she might identify herself. or construct your identity in a role-based manner. So Lionel Trilling, for example, when defining or when discussing sincerity, says the moral end in view implies a public end in view with all that suggests of the esteem and the fair repute that falls upon the correct fulfillment of a public role. Uh, Hegel calls this the heroism of dumb service. Here, dumb doesn't mean stupid; it means not speaking, right? So it's the idea that the person is sort of totally in service of their social role, and they don't do too much to oppose this. Sorry. Okay, so we can see this in Confucianism pretty easily. We can see it arguably in basically any pre-modern society. One of the most explicit examples of this comes from the Analects. The Duke Jing of Qi asked Confucius about government, and Confucius replied, "There is government when the prince is prince, the minister is minister, when the father is father, and the son is son." "Good," said the Duke. "If indeed the prince not be prince, the minister not minister, the father not father, the son not son, although I have my grain, can I eat it?" Right? So this is sort of very clearly an idea that the way that the society should run has to do with people fulfilling their specific social roles. In the Mencius, you also have a discussion, a very sort of explicit discussion, arguably, of role-based understanding of the person. The king says to Mencius, "I have a sickness, I'm fond of sex." And the reply is, "Formerly, King Tai was fond of beauty or fond of sex, and he loved his wife. It is said in the book of poetry, Gu Gong Tanfu came in the morning, galloping his horse by the banks of the western waters, as far as the foot of Qi Hill, along with the lady of Jiang. They came together and chose a site for their settlement. At that time, in the seclusion of the house, there was no dissatisfied woman, and abroad there were no unmarried men. If your majesty loves beauty, let the people be able to gratify the same feeling, and what difficulty will there be in attaining your royal sway?" So Mencius doesn't reprimand the king then for his personal sort of sinfulness or any character flaw. For Mencius, the problem is the king's misunderstanding of what it means to be king. In order to govern morally, the king should acknowledge that everyone is fond of sex, but that this fondness is best exercised in the form of love, marriage, and having children. This places the emphasis on King Shen's role in his relationships with others. As an individual, there's nothing really wrong with King Shen. He does not need to undergo some sort of psychotherapeutic treatment or take medicine to curb his sexual desire. The idea is that once he's able to identify himself with his role, he's more likely to form better habits and more appropriate ways of interacting with others. So oftentimes this more role-based understanding is associated with pre-modern societies or pre-modern understandings. So here you also have identity in generations. Many thinkers find pre-modern societies as having established generational roles that serve as basically as social placeholders for individuals, and further provide an identity that's almost universal in its recognition by other members of that society, right? So the idea is that other people sort of readily recognize you, whatever, by your clothing or such, and that this tells them tons and tons about you. So one is not simply the baker, which determines how one thinks of oneself, others, and objects around them, but one is also part of a societal and familial tradition. There are and have been numerous other bakers, likely including one's own ancestors, and as a baker, one is carrying forth, through living, their tradition. One's identity and relationships are thus largely predictable, which rests on the stability of society and the slowness of change. So this is obviously a more sort of sociological analysis. Also in this understanding, normally you have fairly fixed social norms or expectations, right? So as I said, you can basically recognize a person's role based on their clothing. And you know from someone's role everything about them, from their salary, who they're probably friends with, what religion they probably are, their political views, who they'll marry, things like this. So we can then think about some differences between the individual, thought of as a more abstract or unique essence, and the person or the role-based person who's identified through social roles and relationships and interactions. So one way we might think about this is expressed in these images below. The image on the left, the three circles on the left, can be representative of this more role-based person. So the gray part indicates where meaning is whatever achieved or emerges or constructed. And so the idea is in interactions with others or in fulfillment of one's role, that's where one uh, attains or achieves meaning. The other image on the right of the two circles, also you have the gray as indicating meaning, but it's the circles or people are separated from one another, right? So meaning is something that exists already within the individual. And in order for them to more fully realize it, actually, it's better that they maintain some sort of distance from other people or from society. And what we'll see is that many people who discuss and even promote authenticity note this distance as being critical in authenticity projects. So you have a really very, very different understanding of meaning here or what it means to be a person. And we'll also find this reflected in conceptions of agency or how we make choices, right? Authenticity is going to tell us to make choices by looking within. A more role-based understanding, and arguably Confucian or perhaps Taoist understanding, might tell us to take not only other people, right, but also rituals, social expectations, and sort of broader external ideas into account when making choices, and that will actually be far more meaningful than trying to push them away and thinking, what do I really want? Or something along those lines. So individualism tries to or struggles to find identity from within. Rousseau, in his autobiography, I think on the second page, already uh, presents this fairly clearly. He says, I am not made like anyone I have been acquainted with, perhaps like no one in existence. If not better, I at least claim originality. And whether nature did wisely in breaking the mold when she formed me, and he goes on. So this is the idea again that he's sort of totally original, right? Everybody else might fit a certain mold, but not Rousseau. And this doesn't have to mean that you're better, right? Individualism and authenticity uh, normally don't have very well, authenticity in particular, but sometimes it's difficult to construct moral understandings based on individualism or authenticity. And this is because primarily they're interested in being original or being distinct from others. So authenticity then can be distinguished because it seeks to create rather than find identity. That's one way we might distinguish authenticity from individualism. But as we'll see in a few moments, a lot of understandings of authenticity take these two separate trajectories, right? One seeking to create, the other seeking to find, and they see them as more or less the same. So with individualism, the trajectory of examination is inward and then discovering the true self. Uh, so in authenticity, as Sartre summarizes, existence precedes essence, right? So we have to make who we are. Or man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. So from a more sociological perspective, individualism and authenticity are often associated with modernity. As society becomes more dynamic, the once predetermined and all-encompassing social placeholders begin to dissolve or to liquefy. Individuals are thus increasingly able to choose their roles and thus the guiding force behind their identities. It is the direct result of the way dynamic societies liquefy their previous models of selfhood and identity. Individuals are then more and more held responsible for shaping their own lives as social change happens in a form of liquefying of social standards and role patterns. It is a form of individualization that each person must engage in a task of discovering and choosing identity constituting roles and relationships for oneself, and then bearing the consequences. Um, Charles Taylor, from a more philosophical perspective, uh, provides this definition of authenticity. He says it involves the creation and construction as well as discovery, right? So these are the two sort of different orientations or trajectories that we mentioned as distinguishing authenticity from individualism. But for Taylor, and again for many others, they're sort of combined. So for our purposes, I think we can just call it authenticity. It also seeks or involves originality, and then, of course, opposition to the rules of society and potentially even to what we recognize as morality, right? So, of course, moral projects have been associated with authenticity and individualism, but when this is the sort of primary goal, then oftentimes we find morality can be potentially at least sort of put to the side. So this type of authenticity is everywhere. I was watching this show Euphoria. I tried to take a little break from making these slides yesterday, and I was watching the show Euphoria, and I just saw even more authenticity. There was something about going somewhere where you choose how to die or so, right? And it was all about making your own choices and doing it your own way and blah 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 blah, right? Which is, I mean, if you think about a Confucian perspective, for example, right, you would expect, no, no, this is sort of the ritual, this is how you do it, blah blah blah. And that's supposed to give you ease, by the way, right? Whereas in authenticity, the ease somehow comes from the choice, but this can be extremely problematic, as we'll talk about, I think, in coming weeks, right? Because normally there's a paradox of choice, and when you have too many choices instead of ease, you might get a lot more anxiety. So, but anyways, you can see any type of advertisement, right? Cigarettes, cars, the U.S. Army, soap, uh, definitely anything to do with sports. So, but basically, every movie almost, right? Hollywood movies especially, but we find at least in North America and then in parts of Europe, I'm sure, authenticity really celebrated everywhere. So another way to think about authenticity, the term might come from Heidegger's Einlichkeit, which is commonly translated as authenticity. And this means something like originalness or ownness, right? And it speaks to people being aware of their own history and then which then allows them to own their actions, thoughts, and feelings. So in addition to yes, to creating or finding oneself, we might add originalness and ownness as very important aspects of authenticity. And again, how we often, at least in some societies today, think about who we are, who other people are, how society is, how it should be, and also agency. So, looking one more time at Charles Taylor, for Charles Taylor, the revolt against an ethics of sincerity or role based understandings has led to nothing less than a whole age of authenticity, which has deeply shaped Western culture in literature, art, politics, education, and modern philosophy, particularly in the form of existentialism. So Taylor writes, the understanding of life, or this is an understanding of life that each of us has his or her own way of realizing our own humanity, and that it's important to find and live out one's own as against surrendering to the conformity of a model imposed on us from the outside by society, by the previous generation, by religion or political authority, right? And this would of course include um, ritual, right? This is authenticity is definitely anti-ritual. Orlando Patterson defines authenticity as aimed at finding and expressing the true inner self and judging all relationships in terms of it. Alan Kelly describes authenticity as the goal of self-examination rather than other directed communication, right? So again, that sort of image of the different circles, right? One of them prioritizing interconnectedness, right, or looking out, and the other prioritizing looking within. Um, Terry Pinkard, when he's speaking about Hegel's phenomenology, he describes a certain moment of Geist, and this is a moment that perhaps is very much related to authenticity. Nothing can count unless he lets it count for him. And this election of what counts for him is something entirely personal, something that he must decide on his own to do in terms of his own basic convictions. Nothing can count as absolute, nothing is definitive unless he, as an individual, elects to count it as such. So, in addition to what we spoke about in terms of identity or the way that we make sense of ourselves and other people, I think we can also think, yeah, we can start to think about how authenticity also critically shapes agency or the way that we make choices. So it demands that we check and perhaps constantly check, for example, our own thoughts and feelings as both private and isolated, right? So you think about what you really want to do, right? Michael, if you want to buy a new shirt or something like this, right? Don't listen to Dimitra, don't listen to me, right? Don't listen to advertisements. Think about what you really like, right? Doesn't matter if we say that it looks horrible on you, that blah, 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 it doesn't fit, all this, right? It's all about what you really want to do. And you find this, I mean, if you just go out and interact with people, you find this everywhere, right? In university contexts, you find this perhaps most obviously in terms of what major do I really want, right? What job do I really want? But yeah, you can find this. I was giving advice to a student a few days ago about presenting their work, and they said, no, that doesn't really work for me. I like to do it like this or so for personal reasons, right? And I said, yes, but I have more than 10 years experience suggesting things to students, right? And, but, you know, this, again, for this student, that was, yeah, thank you very much, but I will do it like this, right? And, um, I think you see very clearly this the reflection of authenticity in the way that choices are made. So, Dimitra, you and I have talked about some alternatives, right? One is this idea of dispersed agency. Um, so I give the image here. This is my dog and my dog's best friend. This is not the best image because clearly I would like to go out in the snow, but you can think about instances, for example, my dog wants to go out and it's cold and it's rainy and I'm tired, right? And I can take my dog out for a walk and think about how much I don't want to do this, right? I can, you know, really make this separate, you know, give all these objective reasons. Who would want to go out in the cold? Who wants to go in the rain? I'm so tired. I had to teach with Michael. I hate teaching with Michael, right? I can have all these different reasons. Or I can think of my agency, or not even think of it, but sort of allow it to be more dispersed, right? In terms of sharing the enjoyment with my dog, right? Or instead of thinking again, sort of privately and focusing on my own feelings, and it doesn't mean I won't have them, right? But I can think about that. And then ritual also demands this, right? In a different way, right? But with my dog, I can like think of her enjoyment, and that can become part of my enjoyment, or at least maybe lessen some of my non-enjoyment. And in early Chinese thought, you have this in different forms. You definitely have this in the Analects, right? Dimitra, this is what you discussed. And you have this even in sort of more radical ways. You have Wang Bi, for example, a neo-Taoist thinker, right? So someone who draws from both Taoism and Confucianism, talking about how a person could be without emotions. And we might think of someone being without emotions as this sort of mythical sage, right? Who, you know, like Liedza, he just walks on the wind and eats dew. But what Wang Bi has in mind is someone whose emotions are so appropriate, right? And even ritually appropriate that we speak of them as not having emotions because they're not excessive, right? So, and this is another way I think we can start to conceive of what it might be like to think of agency in different ways, ways that are not so much concentrated on my own private thoughts and feelings, which must be isolated and necessarily opposed to, right? Just as in authenticity, my ways of thinking about myself have to be opposed to conforming to society, right? That my way of making choices and such don't have to be opposed to what other people think or expect or blah blah blah, but actually I can bring those in, and by bringing those in, maybe I enjoy things more, like rainy walks. So and then another sort of avenue for thinking about this is just the notion of xing in early Chinese thought or in contemporary Chinese thought. So this point is made in a lot of scholarship, but I'll just rehearse it in case anyone is not familiar. Xing can mean emotions, but it also means the situation or the environment. And so obviously there's a clear connection between the emotions that we have and the environment. This is also in contemporary cognitive psychology, right? In advertising, in the color that McDonald's uses to make you eat faster, right? Bright reds and bright yellows. So this is we have these ideas as well, but perhaps we don't focus on them so much, and that might be something that we want to explore in these meetings. So, Michael, I don't know if you had anything. I know you have to go at 10, so I don't know if you had anything to add so far.
Sure, but if you have more, please feel free to keep going. I can
No,
jump in
no,
at
no,
the end.
no. This is my excuse for I have nothing more. I have nothing more.
Well, let me just say this was absolutely wonderful, incredibly exciting. So I've one quick kind of comment slash question that I'd love to get your thoughts on or anyone else's too. So I am completely convinced by your argument that philosophically, in terms of both the philosophical ideas and even a genealogy that we could trace wherever exactly we decide to put it, that really there is a distinction between a notion of a true self that I should be looking within, finding, devoting my life to, versus a strong vision of authenticity that's all about, as you said, endless creation, endless innovation. What is intriguing, however, is at least in America, but I think it's more generalizable at this stage, but certainly in America, I would see no distinction between those, even though I think you're absolutely right. Philosophically, there is, and genealogically, there certainly is too. So in America, these are absolutely one and the same. And I thought all of your ads were just beautifully chosen for this. So the standard way of phrasing this in America is exactly as you were saying. What should you do beginning in high school and aiming for college? You should be looking within, finding your true self. When you find your true self, you should love and embrace who you really are, devote your life to living life on your terms, forgetting about societal customs. So it is simply your life. And then all of the originality and creativity that's so strongly emphasized is all about always being true to yourself, always loving and embracing who you really are. In America, this has even been institutionalized. So now you can take personality tests beginning very young that will tell you who you are, your personality type, GQH. By the time you get into high school, it will tell you what careers work well for who you really are, what careers do not work well for who you really are. So you should aim, of course, for the careers that match you for who you are. College majors are often chosen literally for that reason. If you're a GHQ type, then here are the types of college majors that fit well for you. So it's all about looking within, finding the true self, and then originality, creativity. It's all because you're always being true to yourself. So it's more of a comment, but now let me get to the kind of unanswerable question, but I'd love to hear just your thoughts on it. what's going on? Because exactly as you said, those are really not the same thing. If there's some already given true self already there at birth, that's ought to be a very different notion than endless creativity and and originality philosophically, as you've noted. These really are developing in two very different strands. And yet, phenomenologically, in terms of at least America, but again, I would put it more broadly at this stage, there seems to be no distinction. So, anyway, a comment, but the question would be, I would love to hear your thoughts um, um, as to what is going on and why that's not even seen as being a potential problem
I think
or
part of
potential
it,
conflict.
yeah. Okay. I think part of it is that you can use this. So I think there's tons of different answers, and if other people have different responses, that's great. And I don't. I'm sure there's not one that's sort of more. Or, well, I'm sure there's a couple that are accurate at least. One way you can think of it is you have some jewel of who you are, right? You can use this image, and then, but it's not very clear. It's difficult for you to see, right? So you have to you're sort of polishing it, or you're trying to whatever make things more clear. So you have something that exists, but then through these creativity projects, which doesn't work well with the image, I guess, but through these different creativity projects, you're working on sort of polishing this and figuring out more who you are. Although the emphasis still lays on that polishing as a creative project, right? But that might be some way to think about how this yeah, I mean, these are basically opposite orientations or trajectories, right? I don't think of anything in the world that you can both find and make at the same time.
Exactly.
Yeah, so no image will work, right? But it might be
Yeah.
something like this. I don't know if other people have thoughts.
Yeah, please, others jump in because I agree. I think there's I can't think of any other arena of life where those would not be seen as two very different things. The fine discovery on the one side, the making and original creation on the other, and yet, yeah, somehow these are seen as absolutely indistinguishable. Yeah, Demetra, please jump in.
Oh, yeah. Let me just point. Sorry, just a small point. Charles Taylor's actual definition there is like has several different parts. It's like 60 words long, and he puts
Yeah,
create and so all these different subsections, but then creation and discovery are together, right? So that's
yeah,
super interesting. Yeah. Sorry,
yeah, I
Dimitra.
agree. I think again, he is correct. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, which is absolutely fascinating.
No, I was thinking that
Please.
this kind of like, let's say, a kind of paradox, right? I think it's somehow also a feature of ritual itself.
Yep.
I don't find like so hard to accept this coexistence of like finding something or finding yourself in something, right? Being thrown, right, in some kind of ritual tradition. And the moment you find yourself in it, you are already somehow creating it too. You also become this embodiment of this tradition, right? Like somehow automatically. So um, that was one thing that was brought to my mind. And the other was that another way that they can coexist is that if we think that whatever is given is like can be completely reconstructed, can be like deconstructed and like just remade from zero, right? Like if we think about, for example, some feminist theories, right, which would hold that you can reassign your own gender, right? Like you can basically start from zero when it comes to your gender. You can call yourself whatever you want. You can use whatever pronoun you want. So you do find yourself in something, in some situation, or let's say even in some kind of nature. But this nature can be, yeah, even magically erased and remade. So yeah, I have this like two extreme ways to think about this this relationship. Either they are already like so compatible that we cannot tell them apart. They're somehow mutually integrated, or they are the one like is like can completely like exclude and destroy, right, the other, something like that. I think we have a participant who wants to say something.
Joe,
Yeah, I'll chime in. So I mean, one big concept in American culture, of course, is self-expression. So I
yes.
think that that might be the link, right? So you have this core self, these like kind of incipient dispositions, and then the task of the individual through all of these personality tests and trying different hobbies, different activities that or the parents task at first when you're young is to find a way to express that core self and develop it in more socially coherent, cool ways, right? So this is why parents you'll try violin, then maybe you'll try improv or something, then maybe you'll try football, and then in college you'll try different majors to see which of these expresses gives an appropriate outlet for your more mysterious core self, and that's a kind of both a discovery project because you're trying to like peer within by seeing what sticks, but it's also this creative project because you're kind of creating more of a social personality.
That's fascinating. Fascinating. Yes, Anastasia, please jump in too.
Yeah, I was thinking about this originality thing that I was wondering if this originality means that you want to stand out necessarily, or if you're trying to fit in a social group like the LGBTQ community. They're not trying to be alone. They're trying to fit into a letter or all of these personality tests. They're also grouping them. So yeah, I was thinking about that. Yeah, if it's authentic, also in a sense that you also try to fit in a group ultimately.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, please, Paul. Yeah, please. No, Paul, please.
I mean, there's a couple paradoxes associated with authenticity, right? And then this is sort of the core paradox, which, well, there's two in here, right? One is that, I mean, if the demand becomes, which it has become, to be authentic, then that's already sort of no longer authenticity, right? Because that becomes an external social demand. So that's already probably, yeah, paradoxical in authenticity. And then secondly, that authenticity is somehow also, because it's become a sort of paradigm of authenticity, it operates exactly as you said, Anastasia, that you have to do authenticity in ways that are recognizable to others, right? So again, that becomes not authenticity or not the originality that it sort of initially purports itself to be, right? So nobody cares somehow if you're authentic in your dorm room and nobody sees it, right? So in order for it to count as authenticity, you have to, get some cool piercings and dye your hair or something like this, right? So this is, this is sort of one reason that conceptually well, not only conceptually, but sort of in its practice, right? It sort of doesn't, it doesn't always play out very well.
Yeah, I agree completely. And just to underline the points, in fact, of both Paul's statement and all three comments before, that, yeah, it is absolutely fascinating that you would have this claim of radical creativity, and yet, like, just going back to the personality test, I mean, it means by definition going to be the case that there are an extremely limited number of slots that you can fit in, and that a test can tell you what slot you fit in, and yet that doesn't bother people. It absolutely is the case, going back to Anastasia's point, that once you're properly slotted, you will find an identity group of similar, whatever you are. So if you're type X, you'll find an identity group around that. And absolutely, going back to Jonah's point, all of this is somehow a self-expression. And so you're being original, you're being creative, but it's absolutely, it is an expressing a true self that's already there. And once you do, the implication would be, but no one would say it this way, but yet it is the clear implication. There are a limited number of possible things that you are that a personality test can pick up, a limited number of identity groups that you could join that are true to yourself. And you'd think that why wouldn't that bother people if I'm endlessly creative? Well, there would not be, a personality test that could slot me into something that everyone else, what other people are slotting into. There would not be a single identity group that would perfectly fit who I am. And yet, in practice, that is not seen as a conflict at all. Yeah, that somehow you will forge a perfect identity in a group of similar, whatever that type is, PQGs, which is absolutely fascinating. I mean, total paradox, and yet people don't, in practice, see this as a problem.
If I can add one example, yes, Michael, also to follow up on what Paul said and Anastasia, something very close to home, right? Academic demands, academic publications, right? Where we are expected to be original, make original contributions, and everybody's just rushing, right, towards that goal, right? But yeah, we are like acting like sheep, rushing towards this goal of making original contributions, and we become this herd that is not original at all in a certain sense, right?
Exactly. And obviously, if you truly did something that we could honestly call original in scholarship, you never get tenure because
never get published.
Exactly. You never even get published because by definition, you have to slot yourself into a pre-existing journal. There have to be external letter writers in that field that can write to how important you are in that field. So by definition, this originality is all about fitting into some identity group. Exactly.
Another popular, common, contemporary example is astrology, or at least how people are, nowadays relate to astrology. So like I hear conversations among my coworkers about, what the different signs mean for your indicate about your personality, etc. And so it seems to be a way that people enjoy getting into astrology. Because they use it as a tool to kind of talk about themselves and each other and their friends and understand their personalities in this like socially legible way. And that's also very puzzling because it doesn't even have like the veneer of science that like something like the MBTI personality test does. But it's very popular.
Absolutely fascinating. And to throw yet another example onto the table, one of the things I find endlessly intriguing in America is the claim that I should always love and embrace who I really am, which means if I do something horrible, I won't be judged as long as I can say, oh, that's just me. That's just who I am. So yes, I screamed and yelled and threw a terrible temper tantrum. But again, that's going to be okay as long as I can say, oh, that's just me. I get stressed in certain situations. That's who I am. And people can judge me by saying, or not judge me by saying, oh, okay. That's just who Michael is. and yet you'd think again, that's in total conflict with the notion of originality and creativity. Like, shouldn't I say, okay, yes, I threw a terrible temper tantrum, so I should creatively become a better person, or at least a different person. And yet that's never the conclusion. So again, it's originality, creativity, but you always have to say exactly the same to this thing that you supposedly were at birth, this true self, and somehow that's original and creative. Again, it's just another example of the same paradox.
Okay, so we wrap up, Michael? I know. Oh, Angelia, sorry.
Well, actually, oh no, we can. There are more hands, and actually, I can go a bit further. So I just explain. I'm at home and it's a half an hour walk to campus and I have a 10:45 appointment. So I have to literally run at 10:15. So I can do the full 75 minutes, but I will be very rude at 10:15. So it won't, no
Quick
long
question.
goodbyes.
No, we'll do a quick question and then you don't have to run. We'll just do a quick. Yeah.
Oh, no, I'm happy to. Just there'll be no long goodbyes, sadly.
No, because we have to talk for a minute after class too. That's why.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay. So Paul and I will have a long goodbye. You all can pay for a long goodbye, but
Yeah, enjoy.
yes, Angela, please.
Yeah, I just wonder, like, can the personality be whatever it can be? Because it's still the personality of humans. We not only call ourselves beings, we call ourselves human beings. So I think maybe there is something that cannot be changed. Not everything can come to 0 point and just be created by ourselves.
Yeah, I completely agree. And yet it's so intriguing. Say that in America, and people would say, no. There are no limits to what I can be. I can be whoever I want to be, even though, of course, that whoever I can be is who I already was somehow at birth. And so it's this absolute limitation, and yet no one would want to say, oh, well, but humans are of a certain type, and there are certain limits as to what a human could be, and there are a limited number of personality types, even though the personality tests assumed that is the case, and yet no one would want to admit that. It's absolutely fascinating. And yes, Martina, please jump.
Yeah.
I was just, I often think about authentic. Can you hear me?
Oh, we can.
Oh, yeah, wonderful. All right. I often think about, that perhaps authenticity and this kind of role-based sincerity, they are kind of two movements of the same pendulum, like I would just give an example. Just by pure accident, I've been reading kind of back to back the Schunze's chapter on ritual and Proust's In Search of the Lost Time. And there is so much about these ritualized behaviors in Proust. It's really a treat. It's wonderful in to read it kind of back to back with Schunze and Confucians. And when you read Schunze, there is this beautiful description of these morning rituals when you actually use the likeness of life, when you dress the dead person, that they look as if they are alive, but there is something missing, that the scyther is not like the object, the belt is not closed, the objects are not complete, and it makes you, it directs your emotional state to the fact that this person is not there, and then you find this like, oh, this is so authentically human. This is like you find in this very highly ritualized form the most authentic human experience. And then you read some parts of Proust, and there is this description of some sort of duchess, countess. I'm very bad at these aristocratic titles. Nevertheless, someone very high up in the society. She's about to leave for one of these, beautiful soirees at some other duchess, countess place, and she's visited by her very dear close friend, and he's dying, and he says, well, I'm not going to be able to go with you somewhere because I will die. And in her mind, her role, her social role as this person, as a guest who is about to visit someone else, is equally important as her role as a friend. And in her mind, it's like, no, I'm not going to stay with my dying friend. I have this kind of ritualized obligation to go and have fun at the soiree, and you feel like how anything that is actually human can be killed and destroyed by this overly ritualized behavior. And that sometimes perhaps you cannot talk about one without the other, and that you can find authenticity actually in these ritualized places. Yeah, that's just something I wanted to.
Yeah, well, authenticity also has another connotation, right? It can also mean something like genuine. And I think that this is, I don't know, Michael, if that's why you were nodding your head, but I think this is also something. So in the rituals, we can, maybe it's something natural, maybe it's something historically sedimented or culturally or individually sort of sedimented, right? But yeah, that we can find these sort of connections to what we feel is more genuine, I think definitely. And you can also find that in authenticity. So I think this is a whole nother dynamic that actually we didn't really talk about, what you're speaking to, Martin.
And as a plug to Paul, this is indeed what we'll be turning to later when we discuss in more detail Paul's book, which is absolutely about this. But Martina, I think you're about to jump in again. Please.
Oh, I just something just popped up. I remember a conversation how actually there is also something very protecting about rituals, that when you go to these places that are places of this authentic self-realization, of finding yourself, these places are extremely vulnerable to all sorts of abusers, predators, because like, who is to say that, oh, like, this is not my authentic way of reinventing myself, and that there is this aspect of this ritualized behavior that is actually safeguarding, protecting the weak, and it's also something probably to think about.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah,
we're
I
going
agree.
to end here. Sorry, just so that Michael's not too late and we can still